can hear me. My name is Don Hyder. I'm the Executive Director of the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics here at Santa Clara University, and it's my pleasure to welcome you live here in the room and also our streaming audience today. I'm going to introduce a very special guest who's then going to introduce Subbu for us. You might know that in 1995, a guy named Craig Newmark was emailing a list he curated of tech and arts events in San Francisco to friends and colleagues. That grew into a slightly larger list you might know as Craigslist. Craigslist, by today, now has had over 5 billion ads posted, mostly free. Craig Newmark is a philanthropist, a good friend of Santa Clara University, a supporter of the center, and he's been quite generous in his support of causes, especially in terms of trying to help journalism and the fight against misinformation. So we're very happy to have with us virtually today, Craig Newmark.
Folks, thanks. Hey, you know that in our country today, there are a lot of bad actors who don't believe in what we could call democratic multiculturalism. They're fighting hard to stop that, and as they do so, they're attacking journalists who are trying to stand up for our country and democracy. There are regular people who've been misinformed or disinformed, but they can use social media to abuse, to harass, and otherwise attack journalists who themselves stand up for American democracy. On the other hand, underserved or marginalized communities, they themselves are able to challenge journalism to try to make it more democratic, inclusive. The deal is that journalists acting in good faith are caught between enemy fire, people who don't believe in democracy, and sometimes people who do believe in it, but who want to make it more inclusive. And that's a really, really tough position to be in, rock and hard place territory. How might journalism take a leading role in this battle between anti-democratic and anti-democratic forces? That's what this event is about. It's available both in person and live streamed. As a reminder, all in-person registrations receive the live stream events as part of that registration. Now it's time for me to do one of my favorite things, to stop talking, and it's back to you guys.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you to the SCU Grand Alumni Reunion people for organizing this event and giving us the space to hold this talk. I want to thank Leslie and Joel and Don from the center for supporting me in this talk, for the work that we do at the center. And I want to just say, even asking this question, how might journalism help democracy, presupposes that it probably isn't helping democracy. And a whole bunch of journalists out there would be like, Subbu, really? You want to ask this question after all the work we've done, after all the investigations, after all the scoops, and after all the impact, and after all the legal, after all the changes in law? But there's a reason why I framed it this way. You'll see it in the slides. Before we get to that, we can't do the work we do in applied ethics, especially applied ethics, because applied ethics is about making ethics actually work, making ethics happen, whether it's ethics in technology, ethics in media, ethics in governance. It's about making it work. And you can't do that without synthesizing from the work of lots of people in both the industry as well as in areas that study industry. So I've put a bunch of names here whose work I stand on, and you'll see 4 broad areas: journalism and ethics. I've got a bunch of people there who've done work: media reparations, Christopher Martin, Matthew Pressman, Anita Verma, my former colleague Don Hyder, who's sitting right here. He has a book on white news and class and news. Sciences, all of the behavioral sciences are there. There are neuroscientists there, social psychologists, and so forth. Then philosophy and law, there's people, as you know, lots of people who worked on just justice. There's this entire books on justice. And a lot of that has to do with democracy and reason. So we stand on their work as well. And then last but equally importantly is actually the work of especially historians of democracy, historians of culture, black historians, especially Carol Anderson. So I have to acknowledge all of their work, and at the end of this talk, for those who want, I can send a list of citations of all their work that I use. The second thing I have to say is I need to, so this talk is based on a chapter for a book that will actually come out next year. It's on the same topic, journalism, and it's the J&D word, democracy. Kettering Foundation is actually the publisher of the book, and this is 2022. They're actually a research organization that focuses on what does it take to make democracy work as it should. And as part of that, 11 authors have written for the book, and most of my ideas in this talk are from that. I've got to just say, and just quickly, I'm going to say a few personal things about myself. One, you'll see an Indian accent, you'll see an Indian American accent. I speak to my 7-year-old who speaks in an American accent to me, a Californian accent. So we're a small family where there are 3 accents floating around all the time. And even amongst Indians, there are many English accents. So I often use the word anti instead of the word anti. So in the US, we say anti-democracy, anti-racism. I use anti. So if you hear the word anti, what I'm saying is anti. I'll try my best to switch to anti, but maybe by the end of the talk, I might have used anti often enough that you feel like I might have learned it. It just helps to put that out there. One other note is, in India, I was raised in a Catholic family with a substantial Hindu lineage. Extensive parts of the family are still Hindu. I married a Hindu. My mother split from my father when I was 7, and she married a Muslim, which I discovered 23 years later. Now, so we've got Islam in the family, and I had to discover what Islam was because she was married to a Muslim. So we have 3 groups already, and it's not a surprise to some people that I turned out to be secular at this point, but my brother isn't. He's an evangelical at this point. So there's enough differences across what we mean by the term identity, and a lot of that has to do with journalism. So before we get into the slightly more complicated parts of the talk, at which point you can shoot me down for being scholarly, unnecessary, dense, I'm going to give you a story. This story will track what we actually hear afterwards. Once upon a time, there lived a person called news, and then came journalism. And news got new shoes. And then journalism ethics entered the stage, and for some journalists, it felt like a cage. And then came the internet. Information became an avalanche every day, and then walked in search and social media. All the news is just a click away. And we had an election. But our democracy still got the insurrection. This is kind of where we are today. I'm doing a spin on news and new shoes because at some level, news has always been there long before journalism emerged as a discipline, as a trade, as an occupation, as a craft to produce the news. So today we make a distinction in our work that journalism is actually the method, process by which news actually comes out, but news itself is stuff that we talk about to each other as if it's not necessarily produced in a scientific way, in an empirically robust fashion, and so on. So before I get to a few other slides, quick show of hands here. How many of you here are from the media sector, past careers in media, formerly journalists, or don't either? Anybody else? There's one gentleman there. All right. A reporter or editor or production?
Investor.
Investor, okay. So I'm going to ask you one question. What are your thoughts of journalism? I'm going to put 2 things out there just to put a spin, but I'd like you to shoot this down. So, like I said, investigative journalism is actually considered the moral center. There's a lot of good work that happens, and every day so many informative stories are out from across the press. There's new outlets, niche outlets that produce fantastic journalism. But say a few things, if you will, about what pains you about it. I just want to have 1 or 2 examples before I move on, just to see what you folks have to say. Does anybody have any complaints at all? Is everything so hunky-dory? All right.
I think there's a sense of being swamped.
All right. Abundance, swamped. Great word. There is a slide coming up on that.
I think there's a desire to get it out fast rather than to make sure it's accurate.
Okay. So speed compromises accuracy. Thank you.
I think that sometimes exposés do lead to reforms, but you never can tell which ones will do it and which ones will not.
So impact is not one-on-one. It's not automatic that just because you have an expose, democratic things happen or good things happen. Fair enough. So you got 3 different points there, right there. Let me tell you what we hear. This is in journalism ethics all the time, online, and even as we monitor the news. There's too many outrage-inducing, misleading headlines. Headlines don't match the story. Excessive negativity. We focus on the wrong. We're actually highlighting the wrong as part of democracy, but we're focusing on so much wrong that people feel like the world is just falling apart, and they feel powerless. Excessive negativity. Then there's also the overabundance point, which is there's so many stories about he said, she said. McConnell said this to Pelosi, Pelosi said this to Schumer, Schumer said this to AOC, AOC said this to me, and then somebody brutally took somebody else down, and all of that stuff. And then there's accusations of bias, left and right. And you've got stereotypical portrayals, how a community is shown, what kind of pictures are shown about a community, when a community is shown, is a community even shown at all? And then you can have, so I call this journalism and its discontents. And these have been around for a while. These are not new. I'm not putting them for the first time on this slide. It's been going on. So I asked you this because it kind of sets the stage for what we're going to go over. The first thing I want to do is go over a bunch of meanings, because one of the big issues in this area, because journalism is a cultural occupation, it's not a technical occupation the way engineering is, law, architecture, where the boundaries are clear, the scope is narrow. Typically the way problems are defined in the technical fields are narrow. The constraints are clear. What is a problem is clear. What is a solution becomes clearer. Even there, ethics is now an issue. But in journalism, it's always been out of the culture. There is a method, but it still arises in a way, so meanings matter. So I'm going to go over a bunch of meanings, including democracy, believe me, but it won't be a poli-sci class. We'll go over that fast. And then we're going to talk about journalistic power. This is something that's less talked about. The reason journalism ethics has a role in democracy is because of journalistic power. We're going to speak about that. And then we're going to look at why social media actually messes with journalistic immune systems. We say that the press is supposed to be the immune system for democracy, but the press can't be an immune system if the press's immune system itself gets compromised every time a controversy breaks out on social media. And then we're going to end quickly with what steps are we recommending? My program here at the center at Santa Clara University, which is based on insights from a whole bunch of others, so these are not my own. That will be my ending. So just quickly, like I said earlier, news is supposed to be the actual product, so the output you see, the page on the website or the app that you see with the headline, the body, and all of the comments and the interactions possible, the things you can do on the page, that's the product. And news is there at that level. And that's how platforms see it too. They sort all of the pages on the web, all of the articles, and give you a news feed. So news goes to that word. It goes to actual product. Journalism is how you get the news. So that's the process part. We make that separation, because oftentimes people talk about journalism as if it itself is the product. It's not. It's the whole journey from the time the pitch was given, somebody approved the story, somebody said, I want to do a story, and then they had a lead, they had a tip-off, they had to validate it, they had to go look at a bunch of documents, they had to talk to 20 people, they had to verify whether this is actually happening, they had to make a distinction between a claim and a fact, and they had to go through a whole bunch of things and decide how they're going to actually tell the story. What comes on top, what comes later, what comes in the middle, whose voices are going to be quoted, and so on. So that's a process. The other kinds of things that I'd like to quickly go over is this thing called news values. Hardly talked about by the news organizations themselves. You will not see a web page on just a mainline news entity like the BBC, CBS, MSNBC, NYT, just go look at them on their About Us pages. You won't often see that a page that discloses these are our news values. These are empirically stated by scholars who actually study the news over decades to see what makes news judgments happen. When does a reporter decide that you, the audience, will like a story? Here's how it is, exclusivity. You'll see this a lot on the news, breaking news, exclusive. And then you'll see bad news. You folks know when stuff happens, it's out there. Then when, I don't have to go over all of these words, but if you look at these words, surprise, conflict. One example is what happened with Kellyanne Conway's daughter, Claudia. She was on social media, she's got a whole bunch of following. Whatever she was doing became such a big news story, she had to tell the media to stop. She's a teenager, and this happened about, 8 months ago. So the kind of news values there were actually celebrity, power elite, because Kellyanne Conway was holding an office at that time, and also drama, because there was stuff playing out between her as a teenager and her parents, and all of that was being turned into actual stories. So these are examples of news values. You will not see a major focus on solutions here. How do people actually solve issues? How do they fight back? Those things are there, but it's not often the focus. Now we've got a different thing called journalistic values. I got to quickly go over this because there's a difference between the values that journalists hold close to their heart and how news is decided. So for example, you've got these 4 things here: investigation, interpretation, questioning authority. So you don't take politicians, you don't take the words of an official as true, you go back and check, you just look at the documents. All of the things that people do have to do with the assumption that you've got to question authority. And this was a settlement the press made in the 60s in the US. It broadly transfers to India as well. I've seen how the Indian press works, especially the press that looks at government as an entity whose prima facie decisions cannot be just accepted. So you have to see what they say. Now, there's also indexing, which is if the national interest is at stake and the federal government of that country pushes back on the press saying you can't publish the story, there will be pressure in the newsrooms to not publish the story. So that's called indexing. Sometimes they break through, they have autonomy, and actually many times they don't. You may not even see some stories happen if they're indexing to the national interest. So that's a value. These are terms I'm introducing because these things result in the stories you don't see and the stories you see. Now there are many journalisms as well. You've got, like the terms we used, breaking news, investigative, enterprise, opinion journalism, explainers, solutions journalism, and so forth. The reason I'm not going to be talking about these in this talk, and I'm going to be using the general category, which is just journalism, is because fundamentally to the culture of the work, it actually is common across all of them. How you decide a source, how you decide who's the source and who's not, how do you operate from the time you got an idea or a tip or a lead all the way to when you see the actual final story. There are broad patterns and methods that news people actually follow, and that applies across of them. It may change, like breaking news is often done within 2 hours, within 1 hour, and it may change all over the day, but the fundamental approach is the same. If you take investigative, it might be 6 months to produce one story. And that's a lot of work. And there are people I know who actually spend that much time, and they'll expose a major trafficking scandal in that process. So I want to burden you with a slide which is never a slide that you throw at any talk. You never throw a slide which has this many lines. I'm not expecting you to read all these lines, by the way. I'm just doing this as a joke on you folks. Do you know how many decisions go through before you see the news? And if I just start reading that, what makes a development newsworthy? What goes for fact? What goes for claim? Which facts are elevated? Which facts are not? Whose narratives are pushed? And whose are not? Whose perspectives are centered in the story as opposed to marginalized? Whose frames are adopted and whose are not? It's not just that. I don't want to bore you anymore, but there's a whole bunch more. I can go on and on and on. Whose lived experiences count? Whose do not? Which threats to democracy are actually covered? Now, white nationalism is a threat, has been acknowledged as a threat by the FBI since 2018. It was never a beat in this country till the demand came, let's make it a beat. Why? Because it's a domestic threat and it's in the culture. And in the press, there's always a softness towards domestic culture, but it was easier to cover Islamic radicalism because that's an external threat. And there's a lot of documentation and data from the federal government about these organizations, a list of terrorist organizations and all of that. So it's easier to go after them. It's just hard to go after what's here. And this is not an American problem. This is a problem in every major country. In India, I don't think the Indian English press would have covered Hindu nationalism as well as it would cover external threats from Pakistan. It's just how things happen in the culture. Again, who's quoted at length? How can a headline match the actual story? When must a piece be labeled opinion and when not? This is as simple as that line sounds. That is not working. That simple thing, even the news platforms are asking publishers to label. It's just not as simple as that. And then whose pictures are depicted when you're reporting about an occupation and whose pictures are not. I can fill up this whole slide deck with all of these questions that I know that I came from this industry. All of us go through every time a story is done. We cannot, there is no algorithm, there is no flow chart that can tell people do this, if this, then that, and then your story is out. It's completely, it runs on instincts. As you gain experience, you get better and better, and it's not automatic that you will get the ethics right unless you're conscious of what it is these questions are. So where are we today? We said journalism is caught between democratic, anti-democratic forces. There's a lot of talk about the press being under economic siege, which is true. As you folks know, business models have failed, the business has lost grounding substantially, the reporting staff is thinned out literally, local news is not major at all. But really the siege I'm going to speak about here is the cultural siege, because there are two sieges happening, and they're happening at the same time, they're also interlinked to each other, but there is a cultural siege happening in this country. And my friend Tonya Mosley, who is a WBUR host, said, we're not equipped to meet the moment. She said this at a meeting we had at our council a few months ago, that journalism is not really equipped to meet the moment. And the context in which this came up was after George Floyd and after all the reckoning in this country, which is a cultural reckoning that implicated the media as well, as you folks know. And then we had the COVID pandemic. We had all of the onslaught. So she was like, we're just not equipped to meet the moment. That's what she said. She said it in pain. And I feel that's an important thing to say, because it asks the question, did we meet the moment before? Did we meet the moment 10 years ago? Did we slip? Or did we never meet the moment at all? And I got to ask you that because there's some history there. This is 1969 from the Department of Justice. Federal government, not from a Journalism Ethics Council, not from Don Hyder, when he was a professor, not from anybody else. Few American institutions have so completely excluded minority group members from influence and control as have the news media. This came after the Kerner Commission report of 67. This is the civil rights era, as you folks know. Some of you folks here, I know, are from that time. You're nodding your heads. So I've taken this from a site called MediaReparations.org. Would you believe it? There's a site called Media Reparations, because they're talking about the things that media has done in this country. And if you actually go to that site, you get examples of not just systematic exclusion of black people, but also how. Now, there's another whole set of stories, and this comes from Christopher Martin. He's a professor, again, journalism studies, and he put together a really major story in a book, 2019, so this is not an old book, this is just 2 years ago, on how the news media in the US abandoned the working class. Abandoned literally in the sense of storytelling, newsworthiness, determination. And this has to do with just the word working class, because this country, for the level of inequality we have, has large numbers of working class people. The elite here in the Bay Area are just not an indication of that, as we folks know. So the kinds of stories that would have come in the 50s and 60s, of which he's actually documented examples of those stories just don't happen anymore. And there's a systematic explanation for that has to do with how business works. Consumerism works, and you have to target your stories at the upscale audience because that's what the advertisers are actually going for. So it has been a shift over time, but if you invisibilize people, then you're allowing other people to go after them. And then you have all kinds of side effects of that. So even people who were, it's not just that the issues of, working class people were excluded, it's also what was defined as a worker. It's usually the white male who's shown. But if you go look at American factories even now, there's black women, there's black men, there's transgender people, there's LGBTQ people. So working class is not really one group, it's a fairly comprehensive group, and the opportunity to complicate the narratives was lost as well over about 4 decades. So there is a history of what I call erasure that I've learned about. I came to this country in the mid-90s and I saw the kinds of debates that actually happened as an engineer. Then I moved to journalism and I've learned a few things. And these things you folks may actually already know. Disinformation has a long history. We talk about disinformation as if it's a new problem, and now people have mostly concluded, especially because historians have come back to computer scientists, historians have come back to journalists and said, stop thinking about disinformation as if it's a new problem. It isn't. It's been there for a long time. It's part of the cultural backlashes that have happened every time democratic progress has been made in this country. And I've just put some examples. So why this is important when we speak about journalism and the press is, cultures thrive on actual memories, and when you delete memories and don't actually pass them down, that you are actually not acknowledging all of the things that took place. That's a kind of sanctioning of lies, and that is anti-democratic agency at work. And all of this the press has not been able to catch as much, simply because it sits in the culture. So we didn't meet the moment in the past. We've done a lot of good work. There are sections of the press that keep doing important work all the time. So if we didn't meet the moment in the past, why would we meet it now? And to answer that question a little bit better, we'll have to go to the heart of what the word democracy even means. And I put all these words here because I didn't want to go through another Q&A, since I'll have to wrap up to have your Q&A. So these are words that you hear when you ask people, what does the word democracy mean? People will say elections, self-governance. Some of you might say ballots. Liberty, free speech, opinion, rule of law, checks and balances, rights, all of these things. I'm sure there'll be words here that you folks say that I can add to it, and all of them will be in that space. But one scholar at Stanford, his name is Hosea Ober, he tracked down the Greek origin of the name and what it meant then when the word actually started getting used. And this is like a long saga back to classics, and he's a professor of poli-sci as well as classics. And essentially what he's asserted, it's not been challenged, it is only an 8-page paper. It is not an 80-page paper to go back to the history of the meaning of the word democracy. It's 8 pages. That actually is a signal that wasn't that hard to track this down. That it really means collective capacity to do things in the public realm, to bring about change. That's what it meant then. Because that's when things were breaking out of society in the way we were to what we were kind of going to become. And then all of the other things happened. There's a history of elections and councils and power and representation. And then we get modern liberal rights systems, the whole international human rights frameworks. You have all of that later, but this was actually the meaning that began. And I'm just putting this out here because this is not often actually spoken about. And this has, I don't know why this happened, it just moved so fast. So let's stop here. Now, this kind of meaning has a lot to do with journalistic work, because journalists talk to people all the time and they understand agency. They understand the agency that people have to change things in their own lives. And that's why this meaning is important, especially when journalistic agency interacts with public agency. So there's another important aspect which has to do with the connection between democracy and truth. And the truth word is kind of out there these days because we have all kinds of claims that run. So Sophia Rosenfeld, I hope I'm pronouncing her last name right, Rosenfeld. She's a historian here in the US, and she has written a beautiful book on the connection between the D word and the T word, democracy and truth. And she essentially has shown what really evolved as democracies and what is the actual relationship to truth. And in essence, what she's found in a long chronicling is that truth is actually a collective product of democracies. It's the work that happens. Democracies are set up to produce the truth as part of a contestation. It does happen. And no one entity or person or organization, whether it's a news organization or the government or science, actually has a monopoly over the truth. It is an aspiration, it's messy, it's contentious, but in a democracy, you usually have the commitment to go after it. And what is interesting about what she said is there's a distinction between expert truths, elite truths, truths that people in power have because they know what they're doing, they have access to lots of information, and also public truths, what people have, the lived experiences of people about an issue, about a decision that's impacted them, they have as well. And you often see a contest between the two truths that's always ongoing. And it's only when there's an actual consensus between the two types of truths, between the elite and the people, you have this thing called a shared reality. So the word shared reality that we often speak about these days, there isn't a shared reality in America. There's one side that's off living in a media universe, and there's one side that's in a totally other area. That is actually feels like a new conversation to us, but it's not. There has been this battle ongoing, but shared realities emerge when you have this kind of consensus. And my assertion is journalism has always been one of democracy's truth determination functions. That's what journalists do. You go after the truth and you try to determine it, how it's found. It's not the only occupation, because science also does that. But in this truth determination role, what journalists do is they connect these two groups. Because journalists are often talking to ordinary people on the ground, victims, bystanders, people who've actually seen something, people who live a certain life, occupations, and so forth, and they also talk to experts, they talk to the elite. They have this capacity to connect the two truths and actually synthesize what's going on. So the sense of shared reality can come from journalists if the field actually worked to its fuller promise. And it's also a platform for reason, something that I think some of us feel doesn't exist as often these days, and we'll come to that in a bit. So what really anchors the truth determination role that journalists can have? It's all of these values that we saw. Investigations, questioning authority. That's really what underlies this. Now, I'm going to quickly say a few things about the word truth. It's not just facts, because people sometimes take the truth down to the base level of fact. It's not just facts. It's about portrayals. You can have untruthful, you can have false, just portrayals of people can be false, even though the facts in the story may be right. Exactly. And that's the problem with facts. They're too atomic. They're too small and narrow to build an entire thing on. So all of these things, actually matter. And then when we go, so now having gone this far about words, meanings, and these meta-level things, I want to ask you one question. So this is a folk theory that we have in journalism. I came from this field. I might be in ethics now, but since I came from this field, this is something I imagined as well as a newsroom leader. We all feel that our relationship to the work is that we inform the public. So democracies need informed publics. We help inform. So we do our job. We inform. You, the public, take over. Job done. We move on. So that's kind of the folk theory that animates some of the work, that our job is just to research, find, tell the stories. We make mistakes. We issue the corrections. We apologize if we have to. And we just move on. So this thing about theory of the informed, people and journalists being upstream of that is what I would call an actual folk theory, and it doesn't actually hold up. For one, there's no one public. The word public itself, if you ask communication scholars, are just a completely contested word. There are many publics. There are different types of agency. Agency split across groups, across religious groups, identities, class, and so forth. White publics, black publics, brown publics, religious publics, green publics, local publics. You can have so many publics, and you can constitute a public as a result of an issue that then dissolves after the issue is addressed, and it might be gone. And I've seen this happen in my own life. So for one, the idea that there is one public is just not going to hold up, especially in a vast multicultural society like the US and like India as well. Second, the word information is just vastly overloaded. The idea that we all still use the word information the way we use it is ethically problematic. Just look at it. Facts, science, opinion, explanations, guidance that we put out in the news, spin, portrayals, grand narratives, just plain hyperpartisan text, uncritical repetition of unsubstantiated claims that can happen in the news. We just take a politician who said something unsubstantiated. It doesn't have to be left-wing, right-wing. It can just be how political speech happens sometimes. Even unintentionally, politicians will make an unsubstantiated claim, but that just gets quoted. And that can happen. So it's not useful to just use the word information for everything that comes out, because it can have all of these things. So the idea that we inform the people is a little bit of a stretch. So we got to really go back to all of those questions I put down to scare the heck out of you people. I put all of these there because this is really what's going on in the work. So even if you assume there's information that goes out, which is true, does go out, whose stories may not be in the information is actually as important. So that's why you get into exclusion. And we've already seen this. So there's always been a bunch of weaknesses in the field. And that is one is just plain elitism. And this happens even today. Even today, major newsroom leaders talk about working class people as if they're not smart people. If you want examples, I can give you examples. And then there's this assumption that you've got to be neutral, and it's treated as a moral value, but really neutrality is there because you want access to elite power. If you're not neutral, then the anti-democratic elite will push back at you and say, I'm not going to talk to you at all. I won't give you an interview. Then where are you going to get your ratings? There's always a business call that is playing on why people actually say, oh, we want to be neutral. So the cost is that when you don't take into account all of the democratic factors that play when you're making decisions about the news, you'll exclude people's truths, you exclude their histories, you exclude memories, you exclude agency, you exclude the possibility of solidarity. We can actually invisibilize people. We can delegitimize people's rightful seeking of power. Power is something people seek all the time. Marginalized people, the primary thing they ask is power. That is seat at the table, more than outcomes, because if you have power, then you actually push for outcomes. So since we're talking about power, let's turn the lens back and look at journalistic power. And these are things I'm just going to, again, put out that are actually happening behind those types of questions I asked. I put that long list of actual questions. Behind them is this. Framing is a kind of power. How we frame a headline is our power as editors. What is actually a controversy? This is one of the questions I'm going to spend a little more time on before I stop. Controversy determination. You have, in ethics, I would use the L word, legitimacy. There has to be there has to be a democratically legitimate reason for something to even be a controversy before you decide that you've got to take all sides on it or views on it. Then there's inclusion and exclusion, which I already spoke about. Just simplifying narratives into false binaries, prioritizing, characterization. All of these things are levers in how journalism is done. And I've just put these two in purple because controversies are happening in the social media era simply because you can provoke a controversy. And then you can get reams and reams of stories done. A different issue is this obsession with, prediction. So elite, as an elite preoccupation, whether you're a data analyst or you're a stockbroker or you're a Federal Reserve governor, you rely on predictions. That's what we're always doing. We're doing risk analysis, therefore we need to predict what's going to happen. Now, journalism has also gone down this road, so you tend to predict what's going to happen and you want to tell your audience this is going to happen. So especially during polls. So polling is like a major issue where you tend to predict what's going to happen as if it's actually a prediction, but it really isn't. All polls do is they tell you what the American public is thinking at that point in time. It's a condemnation of their agency to assume they won't change their mind before they walk into the polling booth. You're often polling months ahead of the thing. So the idea that polling is somehow going to predict what's going to happen is wrong. So media organizations agree that they shouldn't be running polling stories as if they're predictive, but yet the language and the tone and the certainty with which they make it a news story makes people think, oh, this is like this. Sanders is going to lose, or Clinton is going to win. And this is part of the power that's at play. Now, just the idea of what is actually legitimate controversy is actually over to Daniel Hallen, who's a scholar who drew this bunch of spheres about what is actually the zone where journalists start seeing this is controversial, so here we got to take all sides. This is consensus, so here we won't take all sides. For example, is the earth flat? On YouTube, there's a whole bunch of video people who say the earth is flat. They call the flat earthers. There's a whole bunch of videos. You can find them. YouTube is trying to go after them. But the consensus we know is the earth is round, we're going around the sun. So you won't get stories from journalistic outlets that the earth is flat because they know it's consensus already. It could be scientific consensus in this case. But you've got the sphere of deviance. Now we look at reparations as a topic. Reparations as a topic really could at least have come into the sphere of legitimate debate. And it didn't come at all. It was mostly off to the sidelines, and it only started showing up after George Floyd. Now we hear some talk about the study for reparations for black people, mostly after 2019. That's an example of how news culture pushed it outside, didn't really open it up anywhere, and it's finally actually coming back. So this is, when you see a story and you think it's a story because it's actually controversial, the only thing I would ask you to do is ask yourself, really? Is this really a controversy? What's going on? So if you make that part of your vocabulary, then it's easier to discuss that with journalists. Now let's look at quickly what's really going on online when we actually take in the news. I want to ask this question, are we a clicky people or are we whole people? Because online we're just clicking all the time. We click, click, click. So the actual behavior is click, affirm whether you want to read the headline or not. Is it part of your values? Are you going to get some kick out of reading the story? Not emotive. And then the skim, click, read, skim. Skim is what people do a lot. Just read the first paragraph, middle, last, just get an idea and move to the next one on the newsfeed. That kind of behavior is part of frictionless design, and it's now considered common, where we're just doing it as part of this mindless news consumption. And it comes back to the point one of you made earlier. There's this overabundance. There's a lot of breaking news. So there's an entire bunch of engagement machinery on the actual business side that assumes this. But overall, what I want you to just take away is we're thinking fast. When we're consuming the news on newsfeed, we're not thinking slow. We're thinking fast. We're thinking very quickly, and that kind of thinking is actually emotive. It is not reason-based. We just, the brain is not wired to actually think slowly when you go clicking at that speed through news. So to actually reason with what you see, to detect that somebody's trying to manipulate you, requires you to be slow. So there's so much information about the brain that's actually come out of neuroscience now and psychology that's more or less being ignored by the press because it has to do with behavior. But the brain is wired to update facts only in the line of the belief you already have. If the fact is going to overturn your belief, you're going to resist that kind of fact. Why? Because that's how the brain's evolved. It has very little to do with whether you're Christian or Hindu or Muslim or you're secular or not. It's just how the brain's evolved over time. We've taken a brain that's evolved over hundreds of thousands of years, and in a matter of 25 years of the internet, we are throwing 1 million pieces at the brain every day as if it is that much. And then you have to analyze the feed. of posts that have everybody's posts in it. So it is hard for the brain to actually keep up with what's on this. And also there are all kinds of, other challenges. It's hard to reason someone out of a position they did not use reason to get into in the first place. This is a well-known thing. So you can throw all the articles at people you want. It just won't work, especially at fast speed. So if you, I'm taking this in the line of the assumption of the informed public just doesn't exist. What you have is people with information in different types of publics, and it's all in a form of, contest. So we've come to the point now where unreason has equal reach, which itself shouldn't have happened. And I'm going to just quickly go forward here. Digital media has actually altered the way we operate with information. So all of the assumptions journalists make about the press, especially the distribution of how their information gets out, just need to be re-examined from where we are in this particular technological era. So that's where we are on our folk theory. So much for folk theories. That is why they're called folk theories. Some folk theories are valid, some folk theories are not. I'm going to skip this slide here for want of time, but codes of ethics have actually evolved. Codes of ethics for journalism in the US. I can show you a quote from 1926, the language used in it. I can show you 1973, 1996, 2014. But by and large, these codes have not kept pace with the demands on society for democracy. There are groups that always want more democracy because they don't have the power. But these codes do not reflect that, and that's why codes themselves are actually evolving, and our center plays a role in this work substantially. So my only takeaways, I'll just stop there, is we can't do journalism codes of ethics at the story level. We've got to step back and look at the narratives. What narratives are these? Whose narratives are these? What are our narratives? We've got to complicate the narratives. And then we've got to center the actual perspectives of the people who don't have power. Opinion journalism has been widely abused. Opinion journalism is supposed to be journalism first, which means factual is true. But opinion journalism in news organizations has become a backdoor for non-factual claims. And news outlets really could put up pages on their sites that actually define what they mean by democracy and what side are they actually taking. They never say that. They just imply that they fought democracy, but they don't really act that way. So, and then just the points I've actually made so far: ethically determine whether something is actually a controversy on democratic grounds. That actually has to be made, and that's a slower decision. You can't do that in breaking news. In breaking news, you're basically saying whatever somebody says is already controversial or going to provoke a controversy, or I'm going to provoke by putting that in the headlines, or just anyway put it out. And we've got to, as a field, we've got to draw deeper from all of the behavioral sciences, because the inputs from the behavioral sciences have already gone into other areas. They've gone into business. They've gone into economics. They've not really gone into journalism as much. And platforms need to really get intelligent about journalism, because right now, all of the news feeds you see, they're mostly treating news as text content. They're not really analyzing journalistic activities that have gone into the news. That's it, people. Thank you very much.
What questions do you have or comments? You can either step up to this mic, or Monica can bring a mic to you, and we also might have some questions online too.
So, thank you for the presentation. Thank you for the presentation. I thought it was really incredibly informative and incredibly dense, but also you are very clear with carrying us through a tremendous amount of information. I just have a couple of comments that I don't know how they contribute, but something that didn't touch on is the fact that news, the word for news when you talk about it is a story. And the construction of a story is a beginning, middle, and end. And I understand that, in the classic terms, you used to have the old inverse pyramid form, and then you went into a more narrative form. And the concern of that is that, particularly in more advocacy journalism, or when you're doing anything that deals with a difficult and controversial issue, the way those story developments are, when you go to deep dive, you try on the top surface, you kind of give both sides and all the issues in the deep dive, but then so many times you have to come back to a little bit of a happy ending. That little click, and so the result, we find that very satisfying. We want that. That's a human need in storytelling. But I think it also muddles how some of the things you're talking about play into it. Particularly, you gave the example of you start at the beginning and you jump at the end. It also has a tendency, when you end with that happy little button, the fact is that we take away that last piece, and some part of our brain wash away the deeper information, the more uncomfortable truth the story is going for. But that's, again, I think that's external to journalism perhaps, and I don't know how that can be addressed. The other comment I make is that, very quickly, is that I sometimes wonder when we use communities so much, and we use publics, what would happen just as a discussion point we used tribes and tribal instead of them?
You tried what?
Tribal.
Tribal.
Or tribes, because ultimately there is that sense of commonality within a particular group.
Yeah. Shall I answer that question now, or shall we take a few more questions?
No, go ahead.
So I'll answer the second question first. There is a tendency among us, we can descend into tribalism very quickly. There is enough neuroscience that shows the brain can transcend between classifications we keep of ourselves. We can all see ourselves as humans in this room together as one category, or very quickly because somebody said, because something happened outside that created anxiety in us, we can go down a few levels, down to tribes, and we can just completely break up into groups. This can happen, has happened, and also we can transcend back up depending on what the stimuli is. So we have that capacity. And I think journalism is supposed to keep us at the human level as a group, as a public, citizens. But if you're going to be quoting other people who are tribalizing us, who are polarizing us all the time, then you're carrying that through the stories. So yes, so the short answer to what you're saying is there is studies that show that the media has contributed to polarization around tribal lines, as much as the media likes to blame social media for having exacerbated polarization. But both of these are part of the digital media system that is accentuating tribalism, that's for sure. I can come back to your first thing afterwards.
Yeah, I had an insight. My favorite news source is The Economist. Okay, I think most people know that magazine. It's a British publication, and it's classical liberal. Okay, I can choose to read it either the hard copy or online. And I find when I read the hard copy, I read it very differently than when I read it online.
Well said.
So I force myself, maybe that's too much of a word, to actually read it, the hard copy. I take it in a lot differently. I stop. I think I read a paragraph, I might read it again. But if I go to the computer, it's that click, click, and first paragraph, last paragraph, let's go on to the next article. So I find that, I don't spend too much time on the computer because I know that happens.
So can I respond to that?
Sure.
Mary Ann Wolf, the name in the sciences thing, she's a cognitive neuroscientist and developmental psycholinguist. She handles literacy in kids and how the brain works. She's also written a book on the reading circuit in the brain.
I read that book, yeah.
And she had a point where she said, when you're reading in print, your brain has a tactile sense, because print is paper when you actually touch it. So the brain is slowing down because you're reading in print, and the experience of reading is different in print and online. And they've done studies for college students on fiction reading, on how much of the plot does an undergraduate student actually retain in print versus reading the same book on Kindle, let's say digital. And there is early evidence that shows print helped them retain the plot more. However, we have entire generations of, undergraduates now who've just grown up digitally, and there's not enough testing on news itself. On news, whether people read news in print will retain more than when they read online, that's a topic of research itself. But by and large, people have given up on print because print is going away, environmentally an issue as well. So
I'm going to hold that to my death.
So the actual solution to that, and I'll get to this in brief, is adding friction. What people are saying is we've got to find ways to add digital friction to the experience so that you can slow people down.
Yeah.
Then maybe the equivalent of what happens in print will happen.
I had a question.
Yeah, and then, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
So when you scroll now, it's based on an algorithm. So what you see next is based on what you just clicked on today. So what are the ethics around the algorithm design, especially on social media and how news appears? Because the more you read something, the more you get the similar kind of news, right? So what are the ethics around that? And how do you do that design of the algorithm?
So there are two programs in our center that actually look at this. My program, Journalism Ethics and Media Ethics, and also Internet Ethics. If you look at the problem itself, before you get to why the algorithm is even needed, if you heard his question, it's about how algorithms personalize news for us. It's because of the fact that it's infinite supply of content coming into the digital system. When you see your news feed, you can have 100 publishers that put out 200 stories a day. That's 20,000 stories that have gone in. There's no way the system will know what you're going to like or not like without some signals about you. So that's why there was always this need of trying to make you personalize for you around the idea that if you don't engage with it, they don't make any money. So there is business and there's engagement, and that's the topic of what happened in Congress this week about Facebook's engagement obsession, but that's there for media too. So if the idea is you have infinite supply and you have to get traction to get people to click on something they like and they want to read, inevitably technology is going to be summoned, because we know the American ingenuity machine. We know how technology works everywhere else. People will find a way to create the newsfeed. So that's why ethics is an issue now. Now ethical interventions are asking about not optimizing for engagement as a metric, not optimizing just for your previous clicks, but asking you a few things about, do you even want to personalize? One platform company, I can't name them because they said this in a meeting with us, they claim that they've depersonalized the news homepage. If you go to their news product, you can according to them, they don't personalize news at all. And that is a response to criticism that you're personalizing the news, and that's anti-public, because the news experience is supposed to create the public, and that means everybody sees the same thing. So there is work going on in trying to actually address this, but this is AI and ethics at the same time. So the issue is alive, but I don't think we've had all the answers yet.
Sorry, we have one time. We have about a minute left for one more comment or question.
Okay, I can tell you first of all, 30 years ago, exactly this summer, my family and we moved from San Jose to Modesto. And I would like to say I moved to another planet.
Modesto has a tourism ad on the radio now. Visit modesto.com. Go ahead.
Okay, so what I want to say is I would like to invite you to do a lot of field studies, because we're only 90 miles away from you. But a lot of the things that you're saying, you could do a lot of active field research in Stanislaus County and expand upon all of the things that you're doing, because it's all happening right there and it's really close to this university. That's number one. Number two, my friend talked about the difference between reading in print and reading online. I spent my life as a reference librarian, working extensively in both school and public libraries. You have not lived until you've seen a high school student or college student say to you, well, I've been searching for hours online for this bit of information, can't find it. And so I say to them, oh, it's over there in that book. It's on page 55. Here it is. Let me show it to you. Oh, no, it can't be real. It's in a book. It's not online. Really? Okay. Now let's talk about this whole lecture that you just gave.
I'm so sorry. I'm going to have to cut you off because the live stream is about to end. Subbu will be around for a few minutes afterwards to talk to you. Subbu, thank you so much. We're going to give Subbu a hand for the great.
Thank you. We can talk afterwards. Shall we let her finish her question?
Yeah, let her finish.
Okay, all right, I'll finish.
Yeah, you can finish.
Okay, so then let's talk about framing. You were very accurate in what you said about framing an issue. Now, my thing is that I live in the Central Valley, and what's distinct about the particular congressional district I live in is it is Congressional District 10. It is our congressional representative won his election last time by only 53%. 4,000 of the voters in our district split their vote. They voted for Trump, and then they voted for our Democratic representative. Now, one of the key issues there is abortion. What drives me crazy about the issue of abortion is that both sides frame it as a moral issue. It's not a moral issue. It's an economic issue. According to the Alan Guttmacher Institute, for instance, if you look at who's getting abortions today, 3/4 of the people getting abortions are at or near the federal poverty line. 2/3 already have at least one child. And 58% of them are people who are churchgoers. And most of them say the reason they're getting the abortion is that they are women in their 20s, and they're not, only 5% are teenagers. They don't have jobs that give them time off. They don't have fully paid, they don't have medical care. They recently had a contraceptive failure, and they recently had a major breakup with their partner. So it's really about money.
So do you feel that the media hasn't caught on to this angle at all? Is that your criticism?
That's right, and they're misframing the issue. And so when we have this controversy about abortion, the pro-choice people say a woman has a right to self-determination. The pro-life people say the unborn person has a right to life. But the problem is that both sides are missing what's really going on. What's really going on is an economic issue.
This is what we mean by, pardon the interruption, this is what we mean by complicating the narrative. If reporters were listening to more people on the ground than the usual frames, then they would discover this. And then this can actually lead a story too. So that at least it gets out there that this is not the binary that it might be. It's a fair point.
That's right. That's what I'm saying. So they're as you're saying, the journalism is misframing that particular issue. That's my point is on that. And the other thing I'm going to say is, as a librarian, our thing as a profession is information literacy. And everything you're saying, you need to be saying to the education profession, because they are not teaching children information literacy.
Thank you. I think there was one other hand up there. Two hands actually. Would you use the mic, sir? Oh.
Thank you, earlier in your presentation, you had a slide that had the words truth and fact.
Yeah.
Not truth in fact, but my question is, one, what is the distinction journalistically between truth, accuracy, and facts? Facts, like the light was green when you drove through it. Truth, did you believe Mr. Smith's version of the accident? And where does that factor into journalism? And then you listed off 3 1934, 1936 ethics codes. Could you give an example of ethical violations journalistically and what the punishments are? I'm not talking about easy situations like a doctor commits malpractice and uses the wrong anesthesia, or anesthesiologist or a lawyer lies. I'm talking about a hunch that misfired when the doctor makes a call. And what is the punishment? What is the actual punishment for journalistic ethical violation, other than being bad-mouthed at the cocktail bar? You know?
So let's start with the second question first. There is no formal system of journalistic accountability today, because journalists as an industry, newsrooms have often pushed back at accountability beyond censure within the newsrooms. So there's no formal thing right now that says, okay, you've made so many mistakes and you've got to leave the profession, like a doctor will lose license. And And that's partly because of the fact that the press is protected, the press's speech is actually protected, and the press makes mistakes as stories actually evolve. So the way the journalism profession has asked for accountability is they'll just run corrections, and at best. So this is a problem. There is a long-running problem in journalism ethics. Scholars want accountability in councils. So earlier, for example, in Minnesota, there was a news council for the state. Editors would come and answer questions from the public on what went on with the story. Why did the story get it wrong? And they would have to justify. So the ideal environment is have a digital council these days. You don't have to do an actual physical council like Modesto. And you actually have to, every month you have a meeting where you explain decisions made. The act of explaining and justifying why you did what you did with your reporting team itself is a kind of accountability. It becomes an actual deterrent. Right now, there is no punishment other than if you make a big mistake in a TV channel, yes, you can get fired. But those things are few and far between. It has to be a capital blunder to actually happen. Even then, they come back after 5 years because we've seen what happens. Now, and this is partly because it's seen as a soft cultural profession where the harm calculation, like what is the harm done by a bad story, unless the harm comes back in a substantial way, like people actually died because of a story, because of a journalistic story, unless that happens, there is no wake-up call to this sort of thing. Now, coming to your first question, facts are really the atomic things. Like if you look at nature, if you look at material, you've got atoms, you've got molecules, and then you've got this quilt. You've got an actual fabric. Let's take a piece of cloth, it's a quilt. The truth is the quilt. Is the actual fuller story, the actual larger story that happens on why, who did what.
What is the story? What is the quilt made up of, to use bad grammar?
It's made up of all of the facts in it, assuming they were all checked, and the whole orchestration. That's why it takes an investigation to produce the truth, and breaking news simply produces facts. Because breaking news will simply say, this happened, this happened, this happened, assuming they verified it. So facts are really at a lower level. Truth is the actual higher level. Accuracy is the method. You're supposed to go, accuracy is both a value and a method. You go after your facts and you actually verify them. You also verify whether all the people who should be included in your stakeholding conversation happen. So whose voices are included and not, because you can be factual and completely inaccurate in the perspectives of the people who should have been included in the story. So you can so the A word is mostly method.
So you can have alternative facts. I'm not trying to be a wise guy.
No, you can have facts. It's just the facts that were left out by one part of the press are going to inevitably get highlighted by a different part of the press. Mm-hmm. They may call it alternative facts, but if they've been verified, then they're just facts. It's just that their narrative selectively included some facts and excluded some facts. So it's at the narrative that the politics plays itself out.
One last question.
Okay.
Oh, is this on?
Yeah.
So I think a lot of news organizations now, especially online, are driven by clicks and what maybe news directors feel people want to hear, the news that they're most interested in rather than maybe what is most important. So what are some alternatives that you see news organizations taking or they could take to kind of change that decision making?
Well, there's three angles that are already in the discourse now on this particular question. One is there's an entire bunch of economists and scholars who say journalism is public good work, cannot be funded commercially. As long as you fund it commercially, this is going to happen. Because commercial interests are always going to say quarter to quarter, what's my revenue? And inevitably, if it's not engagement today, it might be something else tomorrow, and you're still going to go down the road where you are extracting from the public and giving back something as a commodity. So one view is that if it's political news, especially political news, it's got to be non-commercial, like BBC, public media, NPR, and so on. So that's a hard view to take in America because the press here has always been commercial with some non-commercial organizations on the side, PBS and NPR, and member stations of NPR. A different view completely to that view is the solutions journalism people. What they are saying is news organizations are missing the bus by doing negative news and making people cynical and all of that. What they're saying is there's actually business in solutions journalism if you increase the proportion of solution stories that make people want to come back, because it's activating the agency in people that we can live humanly after all. But that is a long-term business call. There isn't a lot of actual business evidence that shows that a news organization pivoted its proportions and actually got more audience and was able to monetize it in the form of subscriptions, because subscriptions as the revenue model is often offered as the alternative to clickbait. You move to subscribers, you get people to pay, but it's very painful to pay. How many publishers are you going to keep paying, $5 and $10 every month? I find it a nightmare to try to manage between the Post and local publishers and so on. So there's also a business problem in how subscriptions can be made easy, like the way you pay for cable. You pay for cable for one cable payment, but you get as many channels as you do. That kind of model people are actually trying. So this is an industry that's trying to transition between the legacy of the past coming into now, where you made easy money so far and now you're not able to all the new ideas that are actually coming from elsewhere. It isn't clear where it will go. But subscriptions are actually better for ethics, because at least you're giving news to people who are paying. But again, you can pander to those people and still raise money. And I think solutions are actually a better frame for news itself in a democratic sense. All right. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your reunion.